Okay, so John's departed. Let's get back to regular content. And we're going to kick off with this news story. Well, there's several, basically, about the Switch 2. Obviously, we're gearing up for the launch there. Several pieces of news emerging. Basically, well, where do we begin? It sort of scales in terms of excitement. First of all, let's talk about this price point. Nintendo are basically saying that they will consider the affordability customers expect. But they're also talking about potential issues with inflation, which obviously has been an issue, and basically the fact that the exchange rate obviously isn't particularly favouring a Japanese company at the moment. Any comments on this one, Oliver?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a bit. Kind of in a vacuum, my baseline expectation would be that the Switch 2 would maybe come in at about $400. Because if you kind of think about it, the Switch 1 price was $300. You do like a simple inflation calculation on that in the United States, you get like $390, something in that vicinity. So that would make sense. But there are some complications, I would say. On top of the exchange rate, which we'll talk about in a moment, the tariff situation is unpredictable, obviously, with the current United States administration. There is a bit of a caveat there, though, in that some Switch 1 units are manufactured in Vietnam, so you could imagine them having a diversity of suppliers. Maybe that would affect them a little bit less. I also think that like the fact that Nintendo is pushing such a big digital marketplace at this point probably gives them a little bit more incentive to price it lower. Personally, even though they're adding a lot of hardware in there, like they have a big processor, a big display, a lot of RAM for mobile device, a decent chunk of storage, I would still expect it to be like probably $400 or $450, I would say, in that range. I would not expect higher than that personally. But there was an interesting article by Kyle Orland at Ars Technica that highlighted some of the issues with Switch 2 pricing with respect to that yen conversion, because the yen is very weak right now, which means that in general, US pricing should be fairly favorable. Because right now it's 152 yen to the USD, whereas in 2017 it was like 114 yen to the USD. And that puts Nintendo in a tricky situation where if they want to price the console kind of quote unquote fairly for the Japanese market, that would mean setting a pretty different price in inflation, in exchange adjusted terms relative to the American price, right? Which would be comparatively a little bit higher there. So there are a number of ways to reconcile that. If you look at what Sony's done, though, they basically just increased the Japanese price a lot, such that the Japanese, like PS5 right now, the digital edition is like $480, even though that means pricing it like way above the PS4 in nominal Japanese denominated currency, the yen there. So I think probably a lot of the costs will harmonize around the USD. I think that increasing the price to $400 will probably come as a bit of a disappointment to some people, but I think that's probably roughly where they'll land, somewhere in that vicinity. I would have to expect, probably, given what they have to stand here.
Yeah, I would guess at a $400 base price, but the SKU that most people are probably going to end up buying will have some sort of value-added extra that will see you paying $450. It's a sort of time-honoured way to extract more value from the market. And to be fair, certainly for the launch period, they can basically name their own price because they're going to sell out anyway. But there's certainly signals they need to send about how affordable this is going to be. And I suspect this is maybe one of the reasons why we've almost certainly got a Samsung processor in there. They probably got a really good deal with Samsung in order to keep prices down because, the cost of silicon is highly problematic, which is one of the reasons why PlayStation 5, Xbox aren't really that much cheaper than they were when they launched like almost 5 years ago now. So yeah, that's interesting. So there's other things that have been talked about. Obviously, Nintendo are saying that support for Switch 1 is going to continue. That's kind of like a given. I'm kind of curious, Alex, whether you think that that's going to result in some sort of element of cross-gen development.
Yes.
I think there will be titles that straddle the generations. Nintendo itself has done it in the past. The question is whether it's going to be sort of as all-consuming to the same extent as it was to PlayStation 5 and Xbox.
I mean, most of Nintendo's game ideas, from a technical perspective, can they've been things that can run on dramatically less powerful hardware in general.
Yeah.
And the scaling there kind of exists to be 30 and 60 FPS on one platform from the CPU perspective, I would imagine. You look, for example, like at some of the most recent, more troublesome titles in performance on Switch. They seem somewhat configuration issues, CPU speed, memory speed, all things that Switch is going to be, Switch 2, sorry, is going to be a lot better at. And I see there could be easily a lot of just the general Nintendo ideas. They're not making like massive, super high detailed first person games or something like that with physics everywhere or something. You know, they're doing kind of like game concepts, which you can imagine running on a variety of hardware. And I think that lends well, other than for example, I don't know, like the next Zelda, whatever that may end up being. I could imagine them pushing, they kind of already pushed the hardware a little bit too far this time around. So I imagine that could be something that would be exclusive to the next gen console to really also bolster the numbers of people wanting to buy it. And just really briefly on price, one thing I was looking up was whether or not 400 is a reasonable price for a gift for a child, for example.
Right.
And I looked up, because, you know, like if you think like the Nintendo console as something that you give as a gift to a child, it's something that's existed for a long time now. And I looked up the price, for example, of a new child's bicycle. It sits between like 400 euros and, 550 euros for a brand bicycle here in Germany, for example. And I could really easily seeing a Nintendo product filling that gap. You know what I mean? So that all seems reasonable with inflation.
Mm-hmm. Cross-gen, Oliver, what do you think?
Well, I'm sure they'll have cross-gen to some degree. I was actually looking this up earlier. Right now, the Switch One lineup for 2025, the things that are penciled in are a Xenoblade Chronicles X or Cross, however you want to say that, remaster for earlier this year. And then you've got a new Pokemon, I think Z to A, and then Metroid Prime 4. So all those for 2025. Plus a Switch One Focus Direct at some point, perhaps this month. People have talked about that as well. So I'd expect to see like at least one or two other smaller scale Nintendo games to fill out 2025. But I think really the question here is how much of that lineup is going to end up being cross-gen with Switch 2, right? I think that's the important question here. And like when you look at some of the Switch 2 titles, I mean, to me at least, it seems like the new Mario Kart maybe could be cross-gen. And then if you look at it from the other direction, maybe the Pokemon or Metroid Prime could be cross-gen. I think in some cases you can look at some of those games and think, well, they would really benefit from a Switch 2 boost. In other cases, maybe you're thinking like in a Metroid Prime 4 situation that it probably is faring reasonably well in the original Switch hardware without a boost, although it would be nice to have it on the Switch 2 hardware. I think 2025 personally will see a lot of continued support for the Switch One, and it will see a lot of cross-gen software. I'd almost actually think that maybe the bigger pieces, like the Mario Karts, the Zeldas, the 3D Marios, games that are likely to sell in the tens of millions, those would be titles that I'd be actually less worried about being cross-gen necessarily, because Nintendo knows that they can sell those titles over the lifespan of the console. I think the real question for me is like, what does 2026 look like? Do they move on quickly? Historically, they have, but they've never been in a situation like this where they have a shared digital storefront across two very similar consoles and somewhat similar capabilities and form factors. So that could certainly push them more in that direction, but I'd be interested to see how Nintendo balances that, how they balance the draw of exclusivity with the fact that they have now 150 million Switch One units out in the wild to service. That's a huge audience, and it's kind of hard to turn that down, right?